Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello again, and thank you for choosing IT Pro TV, helping you learn wherever you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, as we continue on with CompTIA A+ 902. And guess who's bringing us the information we need? The one, the only, Wes Bryan, right over here. Wes, how you doing?
Oh man, I'm doing great. Great to be back here, and that is right. We are continuing along with our 220-902 series, and we're going to kind of be deviating away from some of the fun stuff we've been looking at when we've been looking at things like our software. We've been talking about operating systems, and I guess we're not going too far out of software. We're still kind of hand in hand, but we're going to really look at more operational procedures. So if you guys are following along, guys and gals out there are following along with us, we are in Domain 5.0 talking about operational procedures, and more specifically, we're going to be looking at privacy concepts. We're going to be looking at licensing concepts as well as policy concepts, and it is important. Now, I couldn't get the actual objectives in our title here. We try to do that so you guys can follow along with us and you can know where we're at here, but there's pretty much in this objective title here, it's almost like a master's thesis. So let's go ahead and let you guys and gals know out there. This is 5.3, summarize the process of addressing prohibited content and prohibited activity, if you will, and explain privacy, licensing, and policy concepts. So that is what we're going to be looking at today. Now, keep in mind, when we talk about prohibited content and activities, there's stuff that comes to mind, I'm sure, the moment I say that, when we talk about not safe for work, things that shouldn't be in the workplace, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that we're going to, when we talk about prohibited activity or prohibited content, really falls into that category, right? There are definitely federal regulations, federal laws, right? But there's also state-to-state regulations as well as local, county regulations as well. So, for instance, right, not every state prohibits online gambling, right? So online gambling in certain states, it's absolutely fine, right? But that doesn't mean it's fine for your company. It doesn't mean that you can use company resources to view and use things like that, right? I want you to think of things like social media, right? Social media isn't particularly a bad thing. I mean, it can be a bad thing, but just like anything else in any digital media situation or information system, it can have its goods and bads, right? From a marketing standpoint, social media can be amazing. You can take a product and you can get it out to 500,000 people within minutes, right? But at the same time, you can take that same 500,000 people and you can release documentation that really should have been kept internal to the company and never should have hit the social media. So even things like that could be prohibited content and activity. So again, I don't want you to think just necessarily that it has to be those sites and those activities that we know, whether you're at work or whether you're at home or you shouldn't be taken part of, right, that are against the law. We're also talking about the policy aspect of it, right? Because we've talked in other episodes about things like AUPs, right? Acceptable use policies, right? What is an acceptable use policy? Well, they come in many different shapes and sizes, right? They come in many different forms. And an acceptable use policy just says, hey, company's got resources, and what is the adequate, right? What is the expected utilization? What is the proper utilization of that resource? Could be something as simple as a wireless network, right? Could be something like a company computer. Could be a public kiosk, right? So this doesn't necessarily mean that it could just be internally to your company and your internal employees. It could be your customers walking through the front door that have public access to that kiosk computer and they're logging into it as well, and you have some kind of acceptable use policy there as well. Think about public libraries, right? Public libraries, they usually give you some kind of public access to their network, their wireless network, both, or even their public computers, right? But even they have acceptable use policies. So those are some of the things that we have to look at when we dive into privacy, license, policy. License, now what are we talking about when we say license? Well, this is going back to software, right? Even though we're not talking about hands-on working with the software at this point, but what we're talking about is how you acquire that software and how you utilize that software, whether it be from a personal standpoint, a small office, home office, right up to something like a corporate environment in which you maybe need thousands of licenses, right? How do the license apply, right? So we're going to look at things like that, and then really, when it comes down to it, all of this will be policy driven, right? Some kind of formal statement to your company or by your company to customers, to employees, to even the employers themselves on what is their responsibility as well, because you really need responsibilities that are clearly defined for both sides of the tracks. Not just responsibilities that ensure that the company is protected, but also responsibilities that ensure the employees and customers are protected. So that's some of the things that we're going to look at as we dive into this episode. One of the first things that we're going to talk about is really related to things like your prohibited conduct and prohibited activity. And that's something known as incident response. Incident response is something that's very, very important to understand the concepts behind something like an incident response plan or an IRP.
So an incident response is a policy, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. Is there like one step? Is there multiple steps?
You know, there usually is more than one step. You know, even just let's say simply you got identification, and then we have to respond, right? So incident response is identifying that something's happened, right? As well as how do we respond to an incident that's occurred, right? Now, I want you to understand that we've got different kinds of incident response, right? You can have security incidences, and keep in mind that we're not really in the security section here, and as you go on to more advanced training, you're definitely going to see that security response, right? Security incident. Well, what's a security incident? Typically, that boils down to some kind of security breach, right? The security breach is nothing more than a violation of a security policy. But we're not necessarily saying that it could be something related to information security, as it could just be a violation of a policy that leads to maybe some kind of civil litigation, could be some kind of, for instance, just a termination, right? So it could be some kind of misuse, and we have to respond to that too. So you can see that there are many, many different types of incidences out there, but what is formally going to be something that your company's going to have, or your employees are going to have to adhere to, and what we really want you to know in the A+ level is that it's really going to be dictated by your company and it's the incident response plan that you have. All right.
Good stuff.
So let's go ahead and let's dive right in, and let's talk about some of the steps that they call out on the exam. One of the first steps that they talk about is, well, first response. All right. Now, when we talk about first response, we're talking about what is known as really the authority. Okay. First response is, and it's kind of interesting that they put identify after first response, right? Well, what do you mean by that? Well, first response, I want you to think of first responders. All right. When we talk about first responders, depending on the situation that we talk about first responders, we could be talking about things like what? Your EMTs. We could talk about things like your law enforcement. We could talk about a security team, your IT staff, right? So when we talk about first response, a lot of times what we're talking about is jurisdiction, right? Who has the authority? Who has the authority to respond to some kind of incident? Then it gets into identification. And identification is going to be a very important step.
So when it comes to identify, who are the players who are going to be put into play?
Yeah, essentially what you have is, well, it really could be anybody. And again, I know I talk about jurisdiction and authority, but when it comes to identification, literally could be the employee sitting next to you that says, yeah, I think I've seen somebody doing such and such, and we really shouldn't be, having that, right? So right. You might call it, the whistleblowers, but it could be, again, it could be somebody that's in management, could be some kind of team lead, if you will. So identification really is really to determine if an incident is happening. Because keep in mind that in your first response doesn't necessarily mean that an incident has happened. You could think an incident's happened. It's the identification part that actually determines that something really has truly happened. So it could be anybody, right? It could be, again, somebody that says, hey, I know we shouldn't be taking personal information down to the wireless network, right? Because the fact wireless networks have security issues that we have to worry about. Or maybe they shouldn't be using a personal device, to pull down company information, because that could be a problem. Somebody says, hey, I want you to look at this Facebook post, that I made, and realizes in the background some kind of notification header that says, hey, you just received an email with whatever, Again, it really could be anybody. The next thing is make sure that it is reported through the proper channels. And again, the proper channels, this has to be thoroughly laid out by the incident response policy or the incident response plan. So the incident response policy and plan could all really work hand in hand. And really, when it's come down to it, I've seen the acronym called both. But reporting it through the proper channels is setting up in the plan, who is it that we contact, right? Who is it that we're going to call when it comes down to the fact that we've identified that an incident has happened. It could be a manager. And think of a chain of authority, right? If Zach is my direct project lead, right, and I'm part of a team or a department, right, and he's the department head. Well, am I going to go to the CIO? Am I going to go to the CEO? Well, probably not, right? I'm going to go to Zach first, and I'm going to say, Zach, okay, I was in this cubicle, and I noticed, John Doe doing this, right? So I'm going to go to him, right? And then who is he going to go to? Well, laid out in the policy of the plan is going to say, well, you're going to go to, maybe he's going to go to whoever his direct supervisor is. Maybe part of the policy says that you don't go to a supervisor above that, but you basically call a meeting right away of the department heads, and then the department heads, they talk about it, and then maybe there's an escalation procedure from there. So again, proper channels have to be, there's no right or wrong person when you say proper channels. A lot of times what it does is it follows some kind of chain of authority. Now here's the next one, and here's where it gets tricky. All right, the next step that they talk about is data and device preservation, and there are several steps in this alone, right? In fact, there are entire forensics divisions that specialize in device and data preservation. In fact, I've got a couple of things that we can do here. In fact, I got a diagram here on my screen here that we can talk a little bit about data preservation, right? When we talk any basic forensics, like if there is an incident where you have to preserve the data, you have to preserve the dice, the dice, I don't know.
The dice, yes.
Or gambling, right? Now I got online
We're
gambling
throwing the
in my
dice.
mind, right? The device itself, right? We do things like capturing system images, right? When we capture system images, what we do is we take a bit-by-bit copy of whatever the file, the folder, the device, the hard drive that it might be, right? You might go as far as doing things like, doing auditing, right? Capturing network traffic, looking at the logs, right? Typically, when we're doing any kind of auditing of an incident, we're going to have some kind of logs that come into play that we can scour for maybe some kind of identifying information. Capturing video, we can do things like that as well. When we talk about capturing video, we can talk about looking at closed circuit TV, right? I want to know, well, was that something that was going on with Zach's computer? Okay, well, was it actually Zach that was doing? We need things like non-repudiation. Maybe it wasn't Zach that was doing it. Maybe his laptop was sitting in his cubicle and it got hacked. Might not even be Zach. I can look at the video and say, well, Zach wasn't even in the office at the time.
It wasn't
right?
me, it was Bob.
That's right. That's
Bob
right.
did it.
You can always say, I don't care what the video says, it lies, right? No, just kidding. But we can scrutinize the video, right? And we can find out again if it has to be like identification of the person that has caused the incident, right? And the other thing with data preservation that we also have to do is taking hashes. Now, in security, we talk about hashes as a way to basically run a mathematical operation across the data, and it produces a fixed output. And if the data in any way is modified, even down at the smallest bit level, which I'm including adding a comma to it, it changes that fixed length value. It's called a message digest or a hash value, right? That's why they say taking hashes, a mathematical operation that produces this fixed value so that if the data doesn't maintain its integrity, we're going to be aware of it. Why is that important? Well, as you basically document your information, right, especially documenting things like changes, but let's say you're going to present it in a court of law. Well, if that data is changed in any way, the prosecuting attorney or the defense attorney, actually not the prosecuting attorney, but the defense attorney can say, hey, that's not my client's data. Something's been modified. You put that there. That person didn't put it there, and it's thrown out of a court of law. Right, so it's very important. Screenshots. Now, screenshots can actually be covering your own area, all right? If you catch my drift here, that can be your own CYA in the fact that you're taking screenshots of what you're doing as you are observing the data, capturing the data, right, and taking it into custody. The other thing that you can do is interviewing witnesses, right? A lot of times witnesses can be brought into court and their testimony can be used in, as a way to validate the fact that an incident has happened, all right? So those are some of the things that we can do as well.
Wonderful.
Now, I did mention documentation and documenting the changes too. This is important. There's something known as chain of custody. Chain of custody is something that we really, really have to make sure that we adhere to because it's one of the most crucial steps in the incident response policy. Again, making sure that the data maintains its integrity as you present it in a court of law. All right, so let me go ahead and talk a little bit about chain of custody. In fact, with chain of custody, you really have a whole entire we could do a whole entire episode in just of chain of custody. But I want you to understand, let's just boil it down to a few things. In fact, I got a little diagram here that kind of show you what chain of custody is. All right, we could simplify the diagram without all these individual steps, and I could tell you, at looking at different chain of custody models, there's all different kinds, right? Chain of custody, when it boils down to, is the fact that from the moment that you acquiesce the data, that you acquire the information, first of all, you identify, and then you acquire it, right? You assess that something has happened and you acquire it. Making sure that as it changes hands, that it maintains the same state it was in from the moment you acquired it, from the moment it's presented in a court of law. All right, and you can see that the chain of custody sometimes can follow really the whole entire incident response plan or policy or procedures, right? So identifying and assessing that something has happened is important, right? And again, that boils down to authority. Preservation of the data, right? That's the big thing, preservation of the data. All right, well, what's the difference between that and acquiring the information? Well, let me tell you, some of the things that you have to worry about, right? So if I walk into an area that I have to preserve the information, and I grab the monitor and I turn it to this way so I can see it, I've just ruined the chain of custody because I touched the monitor. Right, you have to preserve, they talk about preserving the crime scene. You notice that in any kind of CSI, your favorite CSI movie or episode, they don't come in there and start moving stuff and collecting it, right? What is the first thing that they start doing? They break out the camera and they start taking pictures. They take pictures before they put things in bags. They take pictures before they start marking chalk lines. You preserve before you acquire. Why? Because I acquire after the fact. I put them in bins, I put them in boxes, I label, right? That's the acquiescence. You're collecting the information, right? But you're not moving anything until you preserve. So that's important. And you analyze the information. Now I want you to notice as we go through these steps, what are we doing? We're tracking evidence and we're documenting the process, right? And as it changes hands, because you can have multiple departments, right? You have interdepartmental procedures, right? And as I maybe I'm preserving the information. Well, I document that. Zach's team comes in, acquires and collects the information, right? Well, he needs to document. His team needs to document everything that they're doing. And as the information changes hands to the analysis, maybe the analysis isn't done by Zach's team, it's done by another team. Well, we need to make sure that we have thorough documentation, right? We need to make sure that as we're tracking this evidence and as it changes hands, we're thoroughly documenting the process right up until the reporting, right? And the final report, if you will, the final analysis, right? Well, I guess the report is the interpretation of the analysis that is documented and then handed over into a court of law. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have to be a court of law, right? Again, it doesn't mean that it's going to be some criminal type of litigation. It could be a civil litigation, could be internal to your company where somebody gets fired. Well, that firing of that employee could bring you into court, and you need to make sure that this information has stayed in its pristine state, making sure that it has maintained its integrity.
Well, the tracking of evidence, documenting processes, it seems like they go hand in hand. Is that true?
They really do. When it comes down to it, chain of custody is the tracking of the evidence and, again, documenting the process from beginning to end. Again, from the moment that you identify that an issue has happened or an incident has happened to the moment that you have that final report that is presented in some type of court of law. All right. Now, the next thing we have to talk about is licensing. And licensing could be a little bit confusing. Licensing is very important because it could cost your company several thousands of dollars and you're not even aware of it. So that's one of the things that we're going to dive into next.
So I see some more acronyms. Wes, can you tell us some more about that?
Yes, a little bit more alphabet soup here when we dive in. As you ladies and gentlemen know that have been following along with us since day one, some of us as far back as the 901 series that we've done into the 902, know that A+ is never shy on feeding you alphabet soup. All right, well, we're not stopping anytime soon either. So what Zach's talking about, he can see our list of objectives here, and we got something known as DRM, and we have something known as EULA, sometimes called a EULA. I never really like that term. I've always called it the EULA, right? And it gets even more confusing. Not only do we throw an acronym, we try to put some kind of phonetic sound to the acronym, right?
Sounds like uvula.
That's right. That's right. It is it's a Greek dish, right? You're
Yes,
aware of
yes,
it,
it
right?
absolutely is.
So DRM is digital rights management. All right, digital rights management is basically a way that companies can protect their intellectual property. Right. When we're inside of our networks, understand that it's kind of easy to protect your intellectual resources or intellectual property, the information within the information systems that you have, right? How do we do that? Well, we've talked about in other episodes, we've mentioned things like, for instance, permissions that we can set with ACLs, access control lists. I can say Zach is the manager, Zach gets full control over this spreadsheet because Zach is the one that's going to be reporting it to his boss. All right. However, somebody that is maybe just adding information to that that spreadsheet, right? We want to give them right permissions, right? So that we just allow them to add data. But somebody that isn't supposed to have access to that information at all, we keep them off the list with an implicit deny, right? We just keep them off the list. You don't have access to that information. Well, that's great. Well, that information is sitting inside our networks on our information systems. But what happens to that information once it leaves our network? So where software license comes in, right? Because you don't want somebody just to be able to reverse engineer your software, make modifications to your software, a slight little tweak, and then resell it, and then all your hard work is gone for naught, because guess what? They're selling your property as though it's their own. So digital rights management is the way to ensure that your intellectual resources and your information stays protected once it leaves your network, basically, right? Think about software publishers. They want to make sure that people can't just gain access to their software and use it at their own will, and if it is proprietary, and I'll come back to that term in a second, that they're not going to just basically have all of their hard work thrown away because somebody modified it and they resold it as their own, right? So digital rights management, all right? Now, one of the classic examples of digital rights management is in the movie industry, right? There's been a big, for a couple decades now. In fact, anytime you look at a video and it's got the FBI warning on it that said piracy is a crime, right? That's digital rights management. Now, digital rights management and a warning that says if you copy that and you sell their intellectual property, you're going to be fined for it. Now, it goes even farther today with software as well as videos and stuff, is that we can put embedded information in there that can be tracked, right? We can use things like encryption technologies, and codexes, if you will, to make sure that that information has some kind of digital stamp on it. Digital signatures are an example of digital rights management. Now, I mentioned the term proprietary. I'll come back to EULA or EULA here soon. Let's talk about digital rights management. And why would we? Actually, we'll go ahead and mention it here. End user license agreement. All right, when we talk about end user license agreement, this is typically that little check mark that you have to put into, like, with your mouse, you got to click on, you got to click next to install a piece of software, because what it is a legally binding contract between the software publisher and yourself to use their intellectual property. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, that intellectual property is on my property, my computer. That's right, but that doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want with their software. That's where the combination of the end user license agreements and digital rights management kind of run hand in hand, all right? Now, I mentioned the term proprietary, all right? They don't really call out the term proprietary versus open source, but it is something that you should be aware of, whether it's an operating system or any piece of software, okay? Proprietary, what does that mean? Proprietary means that it's actually the opposite of open source. They sometimes call it closed source, but proprietary means a company is making money off of their software, and you are required to purchase it. Now, how you purchase it, what portion of it you purchase, is up to them based on the licensing, the end user license agreement. So let me give you an example. Proprietary software. The Windows operating system is proprietary. It's something that Microsoft, for a very long time now, has made, and they released to the end user. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, I bought a computer, I didn't pay for a Windows operating system. Does that still make it proprietary? I bet it does. It just means that the manufacturer of that computer had thousands of licenses that they were basically issued and they paid for. right? They're called OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. They put the computers together, they pay Microsoft for what is known as a volume licensing contract, and they pay the big bucks, and they bundle that into whatever the cost of the computer is that finally you pay for as an end user. But understand, their software is still proprietary, right? It is something that they make, they retain all of the rights to, and they charge you a fee to pay for. Unlike open source software. Open source software is the opposite side of the tracks, all right? Sometimes called open source software, again, it's not free. You have to be very careful about that. It's not. It's free to use. It's not free as in fact, the guy that wrote the one of the licenses that I'll talk about here in a second, the GPL, Richard Stallman, who was the inventor of something known as the GNU Public License, the GPL, which is the essentially kind of like the father of open source software. Says it's kind of like free to use, but not free as in free beer, right? So it just basically means that it's royalty free. Essentially, you don't pay for it. Provided you follow certain types, again, end user license agreement, you keep it open, other people can view the source code, they can freely make modifications to it, and they can redistribute it to the world. Linux is an example of a open source, again, non-proprietary operating system. I can go to many different distro-based sites out there, and I can download Linux, and I can load it up onto a PC, and I didn't pay a dime for it. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't portions of open source software that you do have to pay for. Usually it's support, right? So for instance, I don't have to pay for something like CentOS, right? The Community Enterprise Operating System. It's essentially the open source software of Red Hat, all right? But I don't get support for it. I have to pay for support. And that's where they can start to make their money. The software that you download and put on that operating system could be proprietary, and you have to pay for that. Or, as well, it could be open source. And that's why it's important to understand these concepts, because it could cost your company thousands of dollars if you violate software policies, right? If you violate piracy laws. All right, let me give you, in fact, let me give you an example here. I've got pulled up on my screen. If you guys ever want to check it out, go to www.gnu.org, right? This is the GNU operating system, and more specifically, what I want is the GNU public license. All right, GNU is a recursive acronym. It means GNU is not Unix, but it's the GPL. You might hear it, right? And again, notice that there are still licenses. You have to follow it. Again, it is open source, and pay attention to it. Generally speaking, you do not have to pay. They call it copyleft versus copyright. Right? Copyright means I'm going to pay a company to use their property. Copyleft means the opposite. It's typically free. All right, now, just because you buy a single license of a proprietary software doesn't grant you the right to use it within a corporate environment. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is they also talk about personal license versus corporate or enterprise license, right? This is another thing. A commercial license or an enterprise license means that you might have to pay for multiple copies of the same piece of software more than once. Let me show you what I mean here. Microsoft for a long time has had what's known as a volume licensing service center. And what I mean by that is if I buy a personal license of Windows, the Windows operating system, I can use that on my computer. It could be a work computer, that's fine. It could be a home computer. But what it doesn't give me the ability to do is to use that operating system, that installation media, and install it multiple times across multiple computers within my network. That's where enterprise license come in. Volume licensing, more specifically, for instance, with Microsoft. But you also have to understand that personal license sometimes means you can use it in your home, but don't take that same piece of software and put it in a corporate environment and start to make money off of whatever the software produces. You have to pay attention to that too. Keep in mind, there's a difference between a personal license and an enterprise level license. A lot of times your enterprise level license allows you to install on more than one device. Pay attention to the license, but it also allows you to use it in a corporate endeavor as well. All right. Let's see here. I know we're running a little bit close to the end of this episode. One of the last things I want to talk about is we haven't really mentioned privacy. We've mentioned piracy, but we haven't mentioned privacy. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about what privacy means. All right, well, privacy, you have types of information. Remember that according to policies, we don't just give out to the public. If we're in a corporate environment and we are taking things like payment card information, right? Credit card information, right? They call it PCI, payment card. That's why it comes to mind, PCI. Payment card information, right? I don't want I shouldn't, and I'm required by law in this case. If Zach comes to my company, buys a product from me online, I have access, maybe not directly, but my company has access to his payment card information. Doesn't give me the right to turn around and post it to social media, right? Doesn't give me the right to leave that information on a printer, right? Printed output sitting in my office, right?
Thank you, Wes.
You're welcome. So we got to keep in mind that we have things like personally identifiable information too. This doesn't mean just your customers, could mean the employees as well, right? Here at IT Pro TV, they have information about Zach. They have information about myself, where we live. You know, what's our our past jobs, what are our job experience, what schools did we attend, what certifications do we have, what's our social security number. That's called PII, personally identifiable information, and it has to be protected. In fact, remember one of the things I told you when we first started out is that there are bodies out there. Standards bodies, right? We talk about standards all the time here at A+, IEEE. We've talked about what else? We talk about ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. We talk about the International Organization for Standardization, right? One of the biggest standards bodies there. But there's also information security bodies too, right? One of them is called NIST, and if we look at here, NIST is what's known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and you can see that they're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, right? Well, they have standards and guides. This just happens to be a specification. I don't want you guys and gals out there to worry about these documentation numbers here, but just to understand that you do have bodies out there that give you advice on how to protect confidentiality, right? Keeping this personally identifiable information confidential, and what you can do to adhere to it, to make it confidential. So you do have to make sure that you have things like corporate end user policies, right? And things like security best practices, right? This gives you security best practices, right? They call that out on the exam, right? Let me go ahead and just mention the objective here. Follow corporate end user policies. That's pretty much we've been talking about with end user license agreements, incident response policies, acceptable use policies, but they also talk about security best practices. This is where you get the security best practices, right? The guide to protecting the confidentiality of personally identifiable information. So keeping that in mind, know that acronym on the exam. Take heed, right? Take heed, my young Padawans out there. Make sure that you are aware of this information, you know some of the terms, you're aware of some of the processes that we've talked about and some of the steps, so that when the A+ 902 exam asks you about these, regardless of what the scenario is that they put you in, you'll be able to get those answers right.
Privacy, licenses, and policy concepts. Wes, wonderful job as usual. I love Wes. He brings so much history into his teaching. I just think it's great. And by the way, there's a lot in the series of CompTIA A+ 902. So you want to make sure you watch all the videos. You'll be glad you did. And thank you for watching IT Pro TV. Remember, a good IT Pro is always learning. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.